The maple tree in front of my childhood home had a scar on its bark, deep and old, shaped like a crescent. My father made it the summer I turned 7, when he was splitting wood and the axe slipped. He never explained it, never pointed it out, but every time I drove up that gravel lane, I saw it. I think that's how he communicated through things that stayed, not words that faded. My name is Rachel. I'm 31 years old, and until 8 months ago, I was a registered nurse working trauma at Vancouver General. I'd spent 6 years watching people fall apart and putting them back together with my hands and whatever steadiness I had left in me after a 12-hour shift. I wasn't looking for gratitude. I wasn't looking for anything except maybe a full night of sleep and a coffee that hadn't gone cold. Then my father got sick. It started as a cough in January. By March, it was stage 3 lung cancer. By May, he needed full-time care, and the house in Merritt, a 4-hour drive from Vancouver, needed someone in it. My younger sister, Danielle, lived 40 minutes away in Kamloops. She had a husband, 2 kids, a house with a double garage and a hot tub on the back deck. She had time. She had proximity. She had every reason to be the one who stepped in. She called me instead. I still remember standing in the break room at the hospital, still in my scrubs, eating a granola bar that tasted like cardboard, when she said, "You're the nurse, Rach. You know how to do this stuff. It just makes more sense." I quit my job 2 weeks later. I packed what fit in my car, put the rest in a storage unit in Burnaby, and drove to Merritt. For 14 months, I was my father's nurse, his housekeeper, his grocery shopper, his appointment driver, and somewhere in there, his daughter. I gave him his medications at 7 in the morning and 11 at night. I cleaned the bathroom after the days the treatment made everything worse. I sat in the oncology waiting room at Royal Inland so many times that I knew the names of the receptionists, knew which chairs had wobbly legs, knew that the coffee from the machine near the window was slightly better than the one by the door. Danielle visited 7 times in 14 months. I counted. Not out of bitterness, at least not at first, but because each visit felt like a small event I'd been quietly hoping for and quietly dreading at the same time. She'd arrive with grocery bags from the nice store in Kamloops, a bottle of wine, a new candle for the living room. She'd sit with Dad for an hour, maybe 2. She'd hug him carefully, the way you hug someone you're not sure how to touch anymore. And then she'd find me in the kitchen and say something like, "You're doing such an amazing job, Rach. I honestly don't know how you do it." And I'd smile. And I'd mean it and not mean it at the same time. Dad passed on a Tuesday in late September. The leaves outside his bedroom window had just started turning. He didn't say much at the end. He was too tired, but he squeezed my hand once, hard, and I told him I understood even though I wasn't sure I did. Danielle cried louder than I did at the funeral. That's not a criticism. Grief doesn't have a volume requirement, but I noticed it the way you notice whether something that's happening around you that you have no control over. The will was read 3 weeks later at a lawyer's office in Merritt. My father's estate wasn't large. There was the house, which was assessed at around $410,000, modest by BC standards, a 3-bedroom rancher on a half-acre lot with a wood stove and drafty windows. There was a savings account with roughly $42,000 in it. And there was the property on Nicola Lake Road, 11 acres of overgrown land with a collapsing barn, an old equipment shed, and a 1-room cabin that hadn't been used since my grandfather's time. Dad had inherited it from his own father and never quite decided what to do with it. It had been sitting there for decades, accumulating property taxes and not much else. Danielle got the house and the savings account. I got the Nicola Lake Road property. I remember sitting very still in that chair and looking at the lawyer's hands while he kept talking. He was explaining something about title transfer timelines, and I heard the words, but they were arriving from very far away, like a radio signal through mountains. Danielle glanced at me once and then looked at the table. We drove back to the house separately. By the time I got there, she was already in the kitchen making tea. I sat down across from her and I think I was still wearing my coat. "It's what he wanted," she said. She wasn't looking at me. She was watching the kettle. "I know," I said. "The house has a mortgage still on it, you know. About $68,000 left. So, it's not like I got everything free and clear." I didn't say anything. And the Nicola property dad always said it had potential. He used to talk about it. You could build something out there. Or sell it. The land alone is probably worth something. I looked at her. I was 31 years old and I had no job, no apartment, no savings to speak of. I'd been living on the small caregiver allowance from the province and what little I'd managed to save before I quit, and that was nearly gone. I had a 2014 Honda Civic with a slow leak in the rear left tire and a storage unit in Burnaby I'd been paying $140 a month for over a year. I gave up my career, I said. Not accusatory. Just a fact, laid on the table like a piece of mail. Danielle set down her mug. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something cross her face, not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it, something she was deciding whether or not to let land. You chose to do that, Rachel. Nobody forced you. I thought about the break room, the granola bar. You're the nurse, Rach. It just makes more sense. Right, I said. I slept in my old bedroom that night. In the morning, I drove out to Nicola Lake Road. The gravel road to the property was badly rutted and my car scraped bottom twice before I reached the gate. The gate itself was a rusted cattle panel wired to a fence post, and it took me 4 minutes to work the wire loose. I pushed it open and stood there in the October cold, looking at what my father had left me. The barn was worse than I remembered. One side had partially caved inward, the roof sagging dramatically, the boards gone silver gray with decades of weather. The equipment shed was more intact, but the door was hanging off one hinge, and there was a family of something likely raccoons that had taken up residence in the back corner based on the evidence near the threshold. The cabin was small, maybe 400 square feet, with a rusted wood stove, a single cot frame with no mattress, and windows that still had glass in them, which felt like a small miracle. I walked the land for about an hour. It was overgrown willows along the creek at the lower edge of the property, wild rose taking over the old garden beds near the cabin, a row of ponderosa pines along the north edge that my grandfather had apparently planted. The lake was visible from the upper part of the property, just a glimpse of silver through the trees. I sat on the cabin step and I let myself feel it. All of it. The unfairness, the exhaustion, the grief I hadn't had time to process properly because I'd been too busy being useful. I sat there for a long time, and the wind came through the pines and I thought, okay, this is what I have. What do I do with it? I decided to stay. Not in the cabin, not immediately. It wasn't livable but in Merritt, at a friend's place, while I figured out what came next. I spent the first 2 weeks researching. The Nicola Lake Road property was zoned for agricultural use with a secondary dwelling permitted. The land itself, based on 2 informal assessments from local realtors I emailed, was likely worth somewhere between $160,000 and $190,000, depending on road access improvement and what a buyer wanted to do with it. Not nothing, but also not enough to restart a life in Vancouver. I started calling the cabin the Inheritance. Partly ironic, partly not. On a Thursday in early November, I drove out to start clearing the equipment shed. I wanted to assess what was worth keeping, what needed to go. My father had stored things out there, old tools, fencing supplies, the kind of accumulated decades of rural life that ends up in outbuildings and never quite gets sorted. I spent the morning pulling things out into the gray light. A post hole digger, 2 rolls of barbed wire, rust seized, a chainsaw that might have been fixable, boxes of bolts and fittings, a wooden trunk I recognized from the house, my grandfather's, dark wood with brass fittings that had lived in the basement of the Merritt house for as long as I could remember and had apparently been moved out here at some point. I dragged the trunk out into the light. The latch was stiff but not locked. I worked it with a flathead screwdriver I'd found in a coffee can on the shelf. Inside, a wool Hudson's Bay blanket, folded. Underneath the blanket, a metal document box, the kind with a key lock, painted gray. And the key was taped to the inside lid of the trunk with a strip of electrical tape that had gone brittle with age. I sat back on my heels in the dead grass and looked at it for a moment. I knew the box. I had a specific, physical memory of being maybe 9 years old and seeing my father carry it into his bedroom and close the door. When I'd asked him about it later, he'd said it was just paperwork. Nothing for me to worry about. I unlocked it. There were documents inside. A lot of them, carefully ordered in labeled folders. The first folder was labeled with the property address Nicola Lake Road and contained the original title, a survey map from 1987, and a hand-drawn sketch in my grandfather's writing showing the layout of the land and some notations I couldn't immediately make sense of. Numbers. Measurements. A circle marked near the creek at the south corner. The second folder was labeled simply Water. I opened it. What I was looking at took me a few minutes to understand because I have no background in this, but what it appeared to be, and what I later confirmed with two separate professionals, was documentation for a registered water license. A water license on Nicola Creek, running through the south portion of the property. My grandfather had applied for and received it in 1961 under provincial water regulations. It had been maintained. There was a record of the annual reporting, in my father's handwriting, going back decades. A licensed water right, registered under the Water Sustainability Act for agricultural and domestic use. In BC, water licenses are property rights. They transfer with the land. They are, depending on the volume and seniority of the license, worth significant money, particularly to agricultural operations, to developers, to anyone trying to establish a legal water supply on rural land. Water is not an abstraction in the interior. It is the thing everything depends on. I sat in the dead grass next to that trunk for a long time. There was a third folder. This one had my name on it, written in my father's handwriting. Inside was a letter, 2 pages, written by hand on the same notepad he'd used for his grocery lists, for as long as I could remember the blue-lined ones from the dollar store in Merritt. I'm not going to share every word of it. It was his, and it was mine, and some of it I'm still working through. But the parts that matter, that made everything reorganize itself in my chest, he knew. He had always known that the Nicola property held more value than it appeared to. He'd had conversations with a water rights consultant in Kamloops years ago, quietly, and had understood for at least a decade that the license his own father had registered was a significant asset, that the land, combined with the water license, made it a genuinely attractive purchase for any number of buyers, and that a thoughtful development of even part of it could be substantial. He hadn't told us because he didn't want the land treated as an asset before it was time. He wrote, "I've watched both my daughters carefully. Danielle needs security. She needs something she can live in and hold on to. Rachel needs something she can build. I hope I've read you both right." He had left Danielle the house because she would not have known what to do with raw land and the work required to realize its potential. He had left me the Nicola property not as consolation, but as a deliberate bet. A bet that I was the one who would walk the land, open the shed, find the trunk, and figure out what to do with it. He had left the trunk where I could find it. He had left the key where I would see it. He had documented everything carefully, maintained the license faithfully, and put my name on the folder. I sat there until the light started going. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I think it's complicated, and I think it deserves to be said plainly. I felt, for about 10 minutes, a specific hot anger toward him, because he could have just told me. He could have said, "Rachel, the property is worth more than it looks, here is why." He didn't need to make it a mystery. He didn't need me to spend 3 weeks feeling like I'd been quietly told I mattered less. And then I thought about who my father was. The maple tree with the scar. The way he showed up to things rather than talked about them. The fact that in 14 months of the hardest thing I've ever done, he said thank you to me exactly twice, both times at night, when he thought I might be asleep, quietly, to the ceiling, and those 2 times meant more to me than any amount of formal acknowledgement would have. He wasn't performing. He was just, this is the only word that fits, trusting me, trusting that I'd find it, trusting that I'd know what it meant. I drove back to Merritt and I cried in the car at a red light on Vaught Street, and a man in a pickup truck in the next lane looked at me with genuine concern, and I waved to indicate I was okay, which was at least partially true. I hired a water rights lawyer in Kamloops in January. I won't walk through all of it because it took months, and there were complications, there always are. But the summary is this. The water license, in combination with the land, the road access, which I improved with a provincial rural road improvement grant I spent 3 weeks applying for, and the agricultural zoning made the Nicola property genuinely valuable. I received 2 serious offers. I accepted one from a family looking to establish a small, sustainable farm operation. They had financing in place. They wanted the water rights. They wanted the land, and they wanted the cabin preserved as part of the purchase, which I appreciated more than I can explain. The sale closed in April. After legal fees, realtor commission, the road improvement costs, and a few other expenses I'd accumulated, I walked away with $234,000. I want to say that number quickly and move on, because it isn't really the point, but I also know it's the thing that makes the story concrete, that makes it real rather than vague. And so, $234,000. Enough to pay out the storage unit in Burnaby, buy a reasonable used car, put a down payment on a small condo in the Okanagan. I chose Penticton because I'd always liked it, and it was within driving distance of Merritt, and still have a financial cushion large enough that I could spend 8 months requalifying my nursing registration and doing upgrading courses before going back to work, which I did. I'm back working now, acute care at Penticton Regional, and it is hard and it is good, and I am not the same person I was before any of this. I called Danielle in February, before the sale closed. I didn't have to. There was no legal or moral obligation. The property was mine. The asset was mine. The decision was entirely mine. But she was my sister. And my father had trusted that I would know what to do. I told her about the water license. I told her about the sale that was pending. I didn't tell her the number. I wasn't ready for that conversation, and I'm still not sure it would have helped anything. What I said was, Dad left me something that turned out to be worth quite a bit more than either of us thought. I wanted you to know that he knew what he was doing. He wasn't punishing either of us. He read us right. She was quiet for a while. When she spoke, her voice was different. Smaller, maybe. More careful. I shouldn't have said what I said, that you chose it. That day in the kitchen. I know, I said. I felt guilty, and I made it about something else. I know that too. Another silence. Are you okay? She asked. Are you actually okay? And I thought about my father's letter in the blue-lined notepad. I thought about the maple tree and the crescent scar. I thought about sitting on the cabin step in October with the wind in the pines and the impossible weight of everything I didn't know yet. I'm getting there, I said. I think that's all any of us are doing. She laughed a little, and I did too. And it was real. Not everything, not fixed, not resolved into something clean, but real. The kind of thing that can be worked with over time, if both people are willing. I kept one thing from the trunk. The Hudson's Bay blanket, the wool one, red and yellow and green stripes, probably 60 years old. It's on the back of my couch now in Penticton. When the evenings get cold and I'm sitting with a cup of tea and the light over the lake is doing that thing it does in October, I put it around my shoulders. My father wasn't a sentimental man, but he knew exactly what he was doing.